I'm all kitted out tonight.
I didn't have enough filament, and I don't have black. It's coming tomorrow. I found a Darth Vader face mask that you can make.
Oh, yeah.
Not a black one, but a plastic one that you can print and put a filter in.
Nice. Mine is sitting in my car because as you can tell, I'm going back to my office reopened today.
Oh, nice.
It's apparently the only office in my 30-story office building.
Really?
And
everyone else is working from home still.
and
my office doesn't understand technology.
No feedback on my mic or anything tonight because I'm not doing headphones or anything.
You sound fine. I think we have the live going. Mike, do you want to double check that?
I'll double check it.
I haven't seen it pop up yet.
Looks
Yeah,
good.
I think we're good. Got a fun little neutral goalkeeper there. I thought that would be be the best approach.
So did anyone watch Bundesliga? I sort of forgot it was coming back this weekend. And then everyone was like, oh, Gio Reyna is starting, and then he's not. And I was like,
so right, because he got injured at the last minute, right?
Yeah. And he got injured at warm-ups, which I'm like, not surprising that that happened to somebody.
So no, we ended up buying a car this weekend.
I saw it. I didn't know if that was today or this weekend.
Yeah, that was that last weekend, and so that took us like 4 hours. But because of all the weird stuff going on, and the guy that we were buying it from was actually in the middle of wrapping up another sale, and so yeah, that took up most of the time, and I had to do some yard work before then. So this is the good content. Just getting the social out. If any of you are with us right now, getting all this good social. Live. So how's that 3D printer, Blayne?
Oh, it's wonderful. I'm still trying to figure it all out, but I'm having a lot of fun with it.
I'm trying to get my wife to use the arts club budget and buy a 3D printer for art class, just so we can have access to one.
Okay, got Reddit, got Twitter with that cool killer.
Mike, there's so many practical applications for it, and it teaches kids a lot of good stuff.
I'm gonna be honest. I'm just gonna assume it has practical applications. I don't want it for practical applications. I want it so that I can print out Star Wars stuff.
He's gonna make his own pop figures.
My black filament,
Leave that there.
my new filament will be here tomorrow. I've used up most of the trial roll that came with it, trying to get it all configured and calibrated. The first thing I'm printing after I get the new filament calibrated in, so that the machine's not going to eat it, is Baby Yoda.
There you go. I got mine.
Nice.
All right, you guys ready for this? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say what I really want. It's not necessarily like a 3D printed, but I mean you could use a 3D application and print it out. I want a hat with the Mudhorn signet on it. But even like a 3D printed Mudhorn signet would be really cool. I really like that logo. And for some reason, Disney hasn't gone crazy with that logo yet. I guess because it's at the tail end of season 1 of Mandalorian.
Okay, hang on. You said Mudhorn?
The Mudhorn signet, yeah.
You guys figure that out, and we're going to get this episode started.
Let's do it.
We've got 5 people watching us. Hey, Ron, what's going on?
Ron is saying super echo.
That's probably
Is that on
me.
Blayne?
No. It's probably me. Thank you, Ron.
Ron, I'm trying without headphones, so if it's me, let me know.
No, I have to take
I
some
didn't
of
hear
this
from
stuff.
you.
I had to take
Maybe
some of
it's
this stuff
free.
apart due to my job when I had the Zoom meetings. How about this, Ron? How's that looking for tonight?
I could tell it was a little clear, so we'll see if...
Me too. Oh, Blayne, that
Mike.
pops up on the stream.
Does it pop up on the screen?
I streamed the screen.
Oh, well, whatever.
All right.
You can't share those types of links.
I know, right? This is going to be fun when I take us off. Okay.
Yeah, Mike, that link's for you, by the way. Tell me which one you want, and I'll get one in the mail.
Oh, man.
All right, here we go. Wait, what episode is this again? Does it even matter? What's going on with this world? Okay, got it. Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the MLS Fantasy Insider podcast. Our suspension week 10 episode? Has it been 10 weeks already? Oh my gosh. This episode is brought to you by, well, Disney, of course. Disney and ESPN, to be sure, future home of the MLS... Wait. Actually, brought to you by MLSFantasyBoss.com and the amazing Patreon supporters of this MLS Fantasy Insider podcast. I love you guys. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. My name is Reid Conley, the owner, whatever. I'm from MLSFantasyBoss.com, and all this suspension stuff has just gotten me just totally out of whack right now. But my name is Reid, and I'm joined by my fellow partners in fantasy, Michael Denton and Blayne Riffle, for tonight's episode. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Doing well.
Yeah, I butchered that. And I may sound weird right now because I am completely kitted out in all of my great FC Cincinnati gear. I got my FC Cincinnati face mask in the mail recently, so I was just showing that off right there.
See, I don't know why MLS would sell a FC Cincinnati face mask. I mean, because I don't think that would stop anything. I mean, FC Cincinnati couldn't stop anything last year. I wouldn't trust it to defend myself from coronavirus or really anything.
Fair, but I bought two of them. There we go. So
You wear two of them over?
I did. I had two back to back.
Multiple masks. You get like a whole stack of masks.
That's what it is. So again, apologies everyone for the botched intro. Some of that was the mask and just general. It's been 10 weeks without MLS soccer, guys. How are you holding up?
Yeah, Louisiana stay-at-home ended, this past weekend, so I was able to go to Mass for the first time, and I opened up the missal, and it was like the 7th Sunday since Easter in Easter time. I'm like, it's been 7 weeks since Easter already? Good Lord! We were in Lent when this started.
It's been crazy, but we can't say without soccer anymore because Bundesliga started back up. So soccer is gradually coming back, and Bundesliga is sort of the test, the worldwide test. I don't want to say guinea pig, but yeah. They're sort of testing the waters to see what this fanless experience easing back in looks like. And the big news, which we're going to open the show with this little teaser right now. If you don't know, since again I butchered the intro, tonight we're talking about our part 1 episode of the best MLS fantasy XI of all time. But first we're talking about Orlando because we talked about this last week for what could MLS fantasy do with the possible reopen schedules. And now we know that the first thing being looked at is a tournament. I don't know, I'm putting that in little fancy quotes for those of you listening because we don't quite have the details of this, but there's going to be the idea is to have some sort of tournament down in Orlando with everybody, fly all 26 teams down there, go have a party in that big Disney ESPN facility and try to put something together which seems like it's going to be different from the regular season. So starting with a tournament, which I don't know if it'll mean anything, or if it'll play into seeding, or if it's just like
substitute U.S. Open Cup?
Substitute U.S. Open Cup, or is it just a little fun tournament to help get people back into fitness? I don't know, but this is the way we're kind of going with hope. What are your guys' reactions to this? Are you excited? Are you concerned? Are you hungry? I don't know. Blayne.
Yeah, I mean that's exciting news, especially if they've got the Disney stuff all on board and will stream it for us. I mean, I don't care if it's meaningless preseason tournament style play or whatever, or if they make up some stupid cup to give away at the end of it all. Like, as long as I get to see my guys play and see the rest of the league play, I'm going to be happy. I have heard some of the players are not too thrilled about the pick being Florida or Orlando, and some of the players may not want to go down there. But I don't know. I was high on Kansas City for a spot because of the multiple complexes owned by the Kansas City ownership group, and then we've got Clark Hunt, who owns a stadium there, and a lot of the other facilities being made available. But Disney ESPN has a set of fields down there and dorms or every Disney park that is remaining closed has on-site housing for guests, and all of that I've heard could be turned over to use for the different teams and give them their own hotel room or an entire floor or whatever it takes to keep the teams kind of separate and give them their own space. So like it sounds like a really good place to go, and all the TV stuff from Disney and ESPN is already there. So it may be the quickest way to spin something up and get the players in an area with a good climate, fun to go to, and if they ever did open it up to small numbers of fans, it's not a bad place to go either for the summer.
Ooh, I don't know. I don't see fans in this
I don't either, but
scenario.
Yeah, I don't know if any fans will be able to come, and you know, I think that's not part of it. But what has been interesting has been the last weekend. You know, New York and California have sort of reversed course today and said, "Oh yeah, we'll let pro sports back in starting, you know, June 1st or May 31st." Or I think California is a little bit later than New York, which is a little weird. But it's interesting because it seems like all of a sudden the states are fighting to get the pro sports to set up or allow games to happen. Now, all states are saying no fans, at least for the time being. And I can see MLS trying to do this tournament as like stopgap. We'll see if travel can come back or whatnot. But I said this whenever we did the episode talking about the future. The Disney facility just makes too much sense for any league. If you want to have someone in one place, that's the easiest place to do it. Disney, Los Angeles. I think it makes so much sense having a tournament. If they made it a preseason tournament, I think that would be kind of disappointing because if you had so many rotations, it wouldn't make sense. But if we're using the 5-person rule and that's the way MLS is going to do it,
yeah, good point.
Then it would have some legitimacy. I don't know what they're going to do with the U.S. Open Cup. Maybe if they just said, "Hey, we're going to make that the U.S. Open Cup for this year and this year only. It's just open to MLS teams, and you know we'll compete it out." And so that way, the trophy would actually have some meaning. We could get that tournament. I think it would be great. Anything at least to have some MLS soccer. Hopefully there can be some fantasy tie-in to it. But it's a good kind of trial run. But I really think what's happened this weekend is with the Bundesliga coming back, all of a sudden you start to see other stuff coming back, and it's really put the pressure on governments to kind of allow leagues to open up to some extent, even without fans. I don't know when we'll get fans back, but I think as long as we had some sort of sport, some sort of diversion, I think that would be a great benefit to everybody.
And of course, Blayne mentioned some of the players are concerned. Of course, we're still going through a CBA right now with some of these negotiations, and all of this reporting comes from Sam Stagel at The Athletic, so you can go check that out. Paul Tenorio also has a lot of the information. The two standard go-tos brought to us by ETR. But they also cite some additional concerns. I think these are very valid, talking about players with families who have little English and what can they do without their significant others to help with translation. What can they do with all of a sudden someone's a single parent who's trying to raise a child with childcare concerns, or even having to travel in general, or being away from their families and other responsibilities. So I think those are all things that need to be taken into consideration, and we hope that the best decision is made. But I think we can all say that if some players need to have some exceptions made or just some accommodations made, we hope that happens, and that those who can are able to go. And if this does come down, I think all of us will enjoy seeing some soccer. And I know that people are considering the staffs of all the facilities and the parks and the teams. So a lot of people have been thinking about this, and we're not the first. And that's what's great for me, is we're not the first with Bundesliga going. So I think we'll have some good information to look at, because we're still looking at a July 1-ish start date if anything happens. June would be moving in and getting some practice in, and then July 1-ish, that early July, is when we could see a tournament of sorts.
Yeah. Now it would be interesting to be how long this tournament would be. You know, if they're going to go down to Disney for a while. Is it a month-long tournament, or then we talk about regular season coming back in August?
They said every team would get at least 5 games. So
So you
some
have
of
to have
this,
like some sort of like group stage
Yeah.
kind of thing.
yeah, multiple games could be
Stage,
played in
yeah,
a
so
day. There might be some doubles near the end, or this could overlap into August. I think the backup plan is MLS is still looking at a truncated season starting in September. So it's exciting. It's exciting to see the wheels starting to turn. It's exciting to see things starting to open up. And even though lots of us are getting masks now as various parts of our standard business and work attire, it is good. It's great to see people coming together to try to do what's right and just help get started and help take care of those who need it. So I'm excited for this news, and I hope everybody else is too. So good deal. All right, that was just the quick wrap up from last week when we were talking about the fantasy what ifs. Check that episode out if you haven't listened to it yet, where we talk about how fantasy could adapt to these various schedule changes. This week starts something fun. We've been teasing it for a while. Started back originally with our MLS history lesson that we had way back in suspension week 1 or 2, something like that. And we're going to start talking about the best MLS Fantasy XI, the best Fantasy 11, the best fantasy team, however you want to say it, of all time. Now, small caveat on that, we're looking at the modern era. So again, check out the history that we went over if you haven't seen that yet to learn when that is. But I'll give you a cheat sheet. It's basically 2012 until now. So that's what we're looking at, the best team. The rules that are only solid right now are that we have to have the team conform to a legal fantasy formation. So that's it. We can't have 4 forwards or 1 defender, anything like that. We have to have a legal formation. So and we're going to wrap all this up at the end. But how we're going to get there first is we're just going to talk about the players that need to be in consideration. Each week we're going to break down a different position and sort of come to our own fantasy XIs that we're going to have for each of us. And then we'll have a final episode where we put it all together and we'll get feedback from you all listening and try to decide who is the best fantasy team of all time. So first, guys, we need some parameters. And maybe these will be individual, but how are you all, you two, planning to approach figuring out who is the best fantasy-wise at each position? Is it total points? Is it points per 90? Is it contributions? Is it top finishes and whatever numbers? Just how are you guys going to break this down in chat? For those of you with us, I want you to start thinking about this as well because I want to hear what you're saying. So, Mike, we'll let you start.
For me, it's about fantasy is about consistency. Those are the players who I always rely on. Those are the players who I always look to see, okay, who are their matchups? Who am I looking at? If as long as they have a good matchup, nothing terrible, I want to try to see if I can get them in my team. So I would probably look towards more of a per 90 or maybe a per points per season kind of thing. Just because you've been in MLS for tons of seasons, that doesn't necessarily appeal to me as much as you were a reliable person every time I put you into my fantasy team, whether it was under the old system of limited transfers or in the new system of unlimited transfers, that when I put you in, you were going to give me good production that I could rely on. So that's kind of the criteria I'm looking at. And when we talk about consistency, you'll hear that from me a lot. You heard it a lot when I talked about my fantasy Mount Rushmore. So that's my main thing is I just wanted someone guy I could depend on who's going to get me solid points and deliver at the end of the day.
Blayne, how are you going to approach this?
Yeah, I'm a lot like Mike, where I like consistency, and I tend to look at points per game or points per 90 for that as one of the key indicators. The more often you're putting up better scores, the higher your average is, the better a player you are, and it shows your fantasy consistency. You do have to worry about super subs creeping up into the really high levels of points per 90 if they come in and make an impact a couple of times. So you got to look at overall play as well, but I tend to gravitate towards points per 90. My big question when we do this is, should I include a minimum number of years in MLS in order to be the best 11? Zlatan came in and put up some really staggering numbers, but he did it for 2 years and now he's gone. So does that make him a fantasy best 11? And I know that's later on, but does that make him best 11 worthy over somebody who has had a
longer, more consistent career in MLS and been a fantasy staple for many, many years compared to somebody who came in, made a big splash. And I tend to hover around that 2 to 3 years point. Like if the guy's only here for 1 or 2 years, he's probably not going to make my best 11 because of that, because I want to see a lot more consistency than that. And I want to have a guy I can trust to play for longer.
So, Mike, one question, but first I want to hear your take on, does the number of years matter for you when coming up with your picks?
It probably matters just as long as they have a few. Like, for example, I think Giovinco was here 3 or 4 years. If it was just 1 year of greatness, I don't know if that would do it. But so I think it matters a little bit, but I don't think it's determinative. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah, I was trying to nitpick your longevity comment just a second ago to see if that's what you meant by longevity, of a guy who comes in like an Almiron who comes in, stays for a little bit and then leaves, or if you were, or on the other end, we'll have to think of those guys who maybe started retiring in 12 or 13, something like that, who aren't going to be continuing on. So, because there is a time frame with this modern history, and that time frame is just about how the scoring was working. One comment that came from Adam in chat that I really like and want to see how you guys are going to take this, because it's going to factor in for me, is like you all, he's looking into points per game, but he's also taking into consideration memorable fantasy contributions. So this may have played more into considerations for Mount Rushmore for some of us. Do you think memorable contributions, he says for his team, I'm going to broaden it to also include maybe the fantasy game, zeitgeist in general, whatever you want to say. Do you think that should play into choosing the best XI of all time?
It probably will when we get to defenders.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Blayne.
I mean, it absolutely does. And I play in a draft league, so I tend to gravitate towards some of my draft guys. And I've got 2 names that I've had in draft that when I originally mocked up a best 11 for fantasy, 2 of my old school draft guys that just been around for forever. Actually, I think 3 of them were in one of my early drafts for a full team best 11, because I do have a lot of good memories with them, but they were big enough names that I used them in the regular fantasy game. I tried to get them in draft. I worked hard in years when I didn't have them to try to trade for these guys. These were guys that really stood out to me as key players. And yeah, I may be a little biased because they helped win me a fantasy league, but they helped win me a fantasy league. I mean, they were good players and they still are good players. And so it's one of those that I can't just ignore my history with them when I'm making this list.
So maybe we'll see a Madronda with you.
Maybe.
We'll see. Now, of course, someplace that might make this easy is we will expand this slightly, because every best 11 and every fantasy team does have a bench. So we'll have a few bench spots. Perhaps we'll use those as honorable mentions, or maybe we'll reserve those for some of the guys who maybe had a substantial contribution to the fantasy game but didn't necessarily do well enough. Or maybe we'll reserve those for something that is substantial to fantasy, and those are our switcheroos or our super subs or just whatever we want to have there on the bench. So for bench spots, how do you guys plan to approach that? Do you want to just put him with 4.0 fodder, or do you want it to be your other, or what? How do you want to pick a best bench, Blayne?
I think I'm going to go on limited budget here, and just,
of course,
we get our 2 goalkeepers, we get our 5 defenders, our 5 midfielders, and our 3 forwards. And I plan to fill all of those spots. And then the 11 can come out of that, but I think we go with the format in the game, and we just do the 5-5-2 with the 2 goalkeepers, and you fill up those spots, and then we can kind of determine what our starting lineup and formation is. But we go ahead and just list off. I mean, both my goalkeepers are ready for tonight, and then next week I'll be back with the defenders, and I plan to have 5 defenders ready for my formation. Now, which ones actually make the starting lineup is still up for debate, but I'll come into the show with 5 defenders ready to list off.
All right, so Blayne doesn't care about those extra little things. He just wants the best 18 for his, and then the cream of the crop for that. Mike, what about you?
So wait, if we're doing like switcheroos, does that mean like we're putting 4.0 people into the lineup? Like,
No. Well, I mean, you can go with whatever you want to. I mean, you could make some arguments of like maybe this is the best 4.0 player that we've always had, who was always injured or never available and always made your switcheroos work out. You guys can do whatever criteria you want. But I just wanted the bench to be available for me.
Best fantasy players who played for the New Orleans Jesters.
There we go. For me, I'm reserving my bench spots to be for a mix. When appropriate, I want it to be a representation of sort of the honorable mentions. Maybe a guy who didn't quite make my best 3 or 4, depending on what positions I'm looking at. Didn't quite make it onto the field for me. But I also want to leave some spots for me for people who I believe still had an impact to fantasy. Maybe I need to value point production or just general skill more. Let me know if you're listening right now. Send me a message on Twitter at MLSFantasyBoss. But I was hoping to reserve some of the bench spots for people. I don't know if I'll pick Madronda or not, but somebody like a Madronda, somebody like that who maybe had an impact still on fantasy and that I may want to honor. Maybe that's too much of Mount Rushmore coming through, but that's where I was. That's where my head was. Okay, so again, you guys talked about yours. For me, I'm still going to try to carry in that impact for me. I want to try to do my best to not just look at the raw numbers, not just look at points per 90, not just look at total score. I want to try to find players who were fan favorites or just players that champion fantasy or that fantasy players flock to or just were part of conversations as part of my best fantasy team. Again, send me your send me your messages, send me your hate mail if you don't think that's the best way to depict this. But we're all going to have our own take, and then we'll come to a conclusion at the end. But I want to try to honor some of the spirit of fantasy with my best team. And to me, that opens the door for it could be someone who is in a top 10 every year for the past 2012 through 2020, for the past 9 years, whatever we're doing here. It could be someone who was one and done. It could be someone who was here for a couple of seasons, like a Zlatan, and then left. Like, I want to leave the door open. I want to have room to just look at this and go with whoever. So I'm trying to take a big approach. Maybe that's wrong, but I look forward to hearing it. Okay. We're going to talk keepers next. So is there anything else you guys want to lay out there so that the people understand where you're coming from before they tear you down on Twitter?
I'll just bring on the teardown.
Bring on the teardown. I love this. Yeah. It was so fun seeing all the arguments and hearing the conversations with Extra Time Radio about their various Mount Rushmore. So we got a little bit of that with our fantasy Mount Rushmore. So this could be fun as well. So bring it on. That's how we're approaching this. Would love to hear how you all listening to us right now or in the future or whenever are going to think about picking your own best 11 for fantasy. So, all right. We're going to talk about each position. And this week, we're going to talk about goalkeepers. You would think this could be easy. You guys said you already have names. You already have your picks. I don't know. There's a lot of good people over the years. So let's start out I'll let you guys pick. I was going to say just give me your names, but do you want to just give me your names of who is your short list, or do you want to just start naming some of the best players over this time span that we think need to be in the conversation?
I want to do either short list or get those top names out there because limiting to 1 or 2 is really tough, and there's a lot of guys who, I've got my 2, but I've got a lot of guys that could easily have been in my 2.
Okay. Well, let's do that then. Exactly. You give me your top 5, and then I'll tell you who you may have missed, and then we'll figure out who your top 2 end up being before we move on. And I'll keep this down. I'm going to keep track of all of this so everyone knows over these next weeks, so that we each have our own little fantasy 11, and then we'll talk about all that at the end when we come to a conclusion. So, Blayne, since you were the one to offer the suggestion, I'll let you start out. Doesn't have to be 5, but try to give you at least 5 so we have something to work with. But just give me 5 or so names of top keepers in your short list.
So I have 5, and I'll give them to you in alphabetical order so I don't give anything away.
Okay, that's fair.
I like Evan Bush from Montreal. Quality, in and out, good team, bad team. He's always put up the good numbers. Not necessarily the best clean sheet option, but bonus points galore all the way through. So Evan Bush makes my list. Stephen Fry, pretty much an Iron Man up in Seattle, played with one of the better defenses the league has seen over that span of time, and has played for so long, just has to be in the list. Tim Melia also makes my 5, a little bit of a homer pick, but again, part of what has been considered one of the best defensive teams over a decade, and that's a hard one. That's a hard one to pass on that. For that same reason, Luis Robles makes my list. Iron Man for a pretty solid defense for so long. Now he's moving around a little bit more with the new team, so we need to see what's going to happen there. But again, week in, week out, somebody you can pick to do, and I guess I got him a little out of order, but Nick Rimando also makes my list. I mean, that career, those penalty saves, everything about Rimando.
Did you give her medicine?
No, I didn't. Okay. Everything about Rimando and his career just screams that he has to be on this list.
Is that you?
So there's my 5.
All right. Yes, Lily, you have us. Mike, who do you have?
So I think I had like a list of 3 coming into it. All 3 are on Blayne's list. I think I'll throw out some other names that could probably maybe be talked about in the top 5. Sean Johnson. Sean Johnson's probably one of the few keepers who always really puts up good, consistent underlying numbers. He's not as dependent on clean sheets as a lot of the other guys on the list are, because of his passing ratings and because of the way Yankee Stadium is situated. When he has a home game, he usually gets a decent amount of stops. I think Andre Blake, usually good for a good PK stop, a lot of exciting saves. If we're talking about memorable fantasy moments, he was always a fun keeper to have, because if you had him on your team, he was usually making crazy stops, and it was just fun, because you got to root for him as he makes a lot of acrobatic stops. It was also usually thrilling because Philadelphia usually gives up a lot of shots too. And then the other person I kind of thought of when thinking about this was Bill Hamid. Very good, very solid for a long time. And when Benny Ball is really in order, DC United's a pretty good option for a clean sheet. So those are kind of the other names I wanted to throw out there.
Who are the ones that you overlapped with? All of his names, or?
I mean, the 3 that I had coming into were Stephen Fry, Nick Rimando, and Tim Melia. Nick, I mean, I poo-pooed longevity at the beginning of this, but I mean, Nick Rimando has been a keeper and has been one of the top keepers, from the beginning of our era to the end. And keepers is probably one of the times where longevity isn't much of an issue, because in MLS they tend to stay, so we don't have the best options leaving MLS right away, at least as often as we see in most of the other positions. But so Stefan Fry, I think, gets in there because Seattle's defense is always good, and he's a clean sheet. But I had him a little bit lower because he was really much more of a clean sheet guy, whereas Tim Melia and Nick Rimando are the leaders in MLS for getting the PK stops and for getting the clean sheets. So I think those 2 are kind of headed above and beyond, because when you're trying to get that one game, if they could get that PK save, it's just such a huge boost to your fantasy, especially in the unlimited time. You're not looking over consistency. Those are kind of the 2 that I was really looking at.
Okay, that's fair. So you guys did cover a lot of the people who I think are worth mentioning. Of those names that you threw out there, Nick Raimondo and Luis Robles definitely have the longest tenure in the top 10 of fantasy players. Each one only missing out 1 year from 2012 to 2019, since we don't have all of 2020. Or maybe we do, who knows. But only missing out 1 year of top 10. So those guys definitely have some of the longevity. And one name I'm going to throw out there that you didn't mention is David Bingham. He's another guy who maybe has gone under the radar, but he has been, especially in the last 4 of the last 5 years, has been a pretty solid keeper fantasy-wise. Oftentimes putting up good numbers to keep himself relevant, and his price hasn't always been too terribly expensive. So I don't know. Are you guys gonna leave room for value? Is that gonna be something to consider going forward? Because even someone maybe a Clint Irwin might be a shout out who's had multiple teams, usually cheap, not always a top 10 player, but oftentimes has been a fantasy go-to for getting your second keeper.
As much as I love value when it comes to normally picking a keeper, if we're talking about, all-time best 11, it's really hard to factor that in too much because, they pretty much, if they're good in starting, they're going to be a 6.0 top-of-the-line keeper. That may kind of hurt Fry a little bit because he usually kind of run away with value because Seattle tends to kind of go on a tear as far as clean sheets, and that just plays really screwy with the pricing system, or at least it has in years past. But I mean, in general, if you want one of the best keepers, you're going to have to pay a premium, but the premium isn't as bad as some of the other places, So I don't know if it's going to really matter, especially if we're saying that this is an unlimited fantasy budget. So
this is unlimited.
Yeah, Dream Team's always max or unlimited budget. So when I'm picking them, I've got to look at unlimited budget. If a value guy does make the list, he'll have earned his spot, but he's going to actually have to punch way above his weight and be hitting like one of the premium guys that's probably going to make pretty much every spot on this list because they're premium for a reason. They're putting up big points.
Okay, we can go with that. Some other premium names that you guys didn't mention. These are also former goalkeeper of the year winners. Let's just start with Tim Howard, Secretary of Defense for the United States. What's going on? Tim Howard, he was goalkeeper of the year 2001 for the Metro Stars, had that great career over in England, came back, didn't do so great with Colorado, but is he not a name for you guys to consider?
What has he done for me in fantasy since 2012?
Okay, he's been expensive and has not performed. Isn't that worth something?
And he displaced, Zach McMath, who was having a really good run with Colorado. And, I mean, if we're going to do one-off years, Zach McMath with Colorado was on pace to have one of the better fantasy goalkeeper years and then got replaced by Howard. And the team fell apart. Howard derailed what was a great goalkeeping situation for all of us fantasy players. I'm still a little upset over that one.
How can you...
Blayne, I'll answer your question. What has Tim Howard done? Tim Howard has done for fantasy is by the Colorado Rapids signing him to such a stupid contract, helped them be terrible for years and helped us give us another team to pick against for years. That's what he's done for fantasy.
I almost feel like what you've said, Blayne, is an argument for why Zach McMath should be the second goalkeeper, just because of the craziness that always happens with him. Zach McMath, by the way, in 2013 was a top 10 goalkeeper in fantasy. Another name, go ahead.
Oh, Zach McMath gave me, I was thinking about him when I was setting this up. I was like, he doesn't have those standout highlights that I wanted, but he's the reason why we need to do another episode if we have time for the MLS journeyman, the all-time journeyman top list for fantasy, just to have that as an extra episode later on.
Maybe we will just have an honorable mention that didn't make our 18. Ron Bodie mentions John Bush as someone who he thinks should be in consideration. His favorite, since he took the the smack talk with Grace during the U.S. Open Cup in Seattle. Dude was also kind of a stud off and on. John Bush was definitely in 12. Did he leave in 13? I forget when Evan Bush came on, because we had a lot of Bushes in the top 10s, but John was definitely there as a top 10 keeper in 2012. For me, though, Ron, I think this is going to be a time when he just doesn't have enough time put into MLS Fantasy 3.0 to really be in this conversation. But definitely some good points about him. Do you all agree about some of these legends? I mean, even Nielsen has to be someone we think about like this.
Yeah, Jimmy Nielsen was an absolute beast while he was playing, but he retired after the 2013 season. We got 2 years of him in this, and that was it. And for as much as I love him, both on and off the field, I can't give it to a guy who played 2 seasons under the fantasy rankings. Doesn't matter how good they were. It's just he doesn't beat out these other guys who have had longer careers that I've been able to rely on for so many more games.
All right, we got to say this name because our Atlanta crowd is going to be up in arms if we've talked about Orlando and not said anything about them with goalkeepers. But Brad Guzan, he was the 2007 goalkeeper of the year with Chivas USA. Again, goes over to Europe, comes back here, playing for Atlanta, definitely doing a lot better than Tim Howard did at Colorado. Is he not worth talking about in this conversation?
So this is what, Atlanta's third or second? They had 2 seasons.
They started. I don't remember.
I think they've had 30. I think in the first few he was a decent pick, but not as automatic.
Okay.
Kazan really got overshadowed by his defenders for me. And I go personal experience with the game. If I was looking at Atlanta, especially when we switched to 3 players per team, LGP or one of their other defenders was always coming up, whether it was Parkhurst or something else. Like, I was always gravitating towards grabbing an Atlanta defender before I would grab a keeper. Guzan and he seemed to have that inflated old Eurostar coming in price point. And he always just seemed to be too expensive, consistent enough not to lose value. And if I was going to spend the money on him, I was going to spend the money on somebody I liked better every time around. So it's just a personal preference there. I just never really went with Guzan. It burned me a few times because he had some really memorable games, some really big games, clean sheet and a penalty save, I think at least once, or just he'd get good numbers and my keeper wouldn't for those weeks. But just price point and everything, and just with the team he was on, I'd rather have somebody else from that lineup, so I never selected him. And I hate to say it, but I mean, we could say the same thing about Toronto goalkeepers too. Like, they've had some pretty good ones come through. But if you're picking Toronto players, you were picking Giovinco and Josie, and if you were going to get multiples, you were looking at every other position besides goalkeeper. And so that kind of jaded me a little bit to the position here. Just with Guzan in Atlanta, I just never picked him, and it's hard to put somebody in my 11 that I never picked.
The other thing about Guzan and some of the Toronto keepers is that they were very dependent upon the clean sheets, because they weren't going to get a whole lot of saves. They weren't going to get a whole lot of passes, because the most part they were focused on, you're going to be afraid of our attack and not generate enough chances because you can't devote people for it. I changed a little bit in the last year of Atlanta, but for the most part, that was the game plan. Even the last year in Atlanta, teams were still scared to death, rightfully so, of Joseph Martinez. So I think it's hard to say, like, if you're not putting up a bunch of saves, I'm looking at a 2 or a 6. And that always kind of played into the consideration of Guzan. He's obviously a very good keeper, very good fantasy option. And, if we're talking about the top 6 of this year, he's going to be in there. But as far as, best of all time, it's kind of hard for just like the 2 really good seasons when Atlanta was a good defensive team to put him in that long.
For me, you guys nailed exactly for what I think about him is there always seemed to be a field player that I wanted more for Atlanta than necessarily a defender. Now, maybe that's a mentality that you were going to have for a lot of the goalkeepers, but I think that's important for when you're choosing these teams, or that's a go-to guy when you're talking about that defensive unit, and especially in this new era of 3-player per team limitations. It's a huge decision to go with a goalkeeper instead of a field player if they have the caliber of a Barco or Martinez or people like that. So I think you guys are spot on for why Brad might not be in consideration. One more name, for actually 2 more names for you guys, and they're newer players. One of them is the 2019 MLS Goalkeeper of the Year, Vito Manone, and also LAFC's Tyler Miller. LA's done really well. Miller has often been a keeper that we've wanted, and Manone had some great pricing. He only has 1 year, though. Is he suffering from the same problem as people like John Bush and Nielsen?
Manone was always a head scratcher to me. I was never all that impressed with Manone. For Tyler Miller, it's the same with Guzan, maybe even more so.
Sure.
His teams generally weren't just getting chances, getting to the back. And the other thing with Miller was the fact that LAFC's defenders were always a little bit more suspect due to rotation and like what Bob Bradley was going to run out. You can never really depend on him. Then there was the price point issue, so it was like, all right, I'll just throw Miller out there as kind of a safe pick and be done with it. And then I can go, up front and get Vela and whichever midfielder or, other forward you wanted to get. So that was kind of the deal with Miller, is basically I don't want to take a risk on a rotation of the defenders. Obviously, LAFC put up good defensive numbers because everyone was terrified to, commit too much. But it's kind of the same with Guzan to me.
Yeah, Miller's one of those interesting cases. When he was on, he was great, but he was a product of his team and his environment too. And I distinctly remember some of the LA fan base being really upset with Miller because he made some stupid mistakes and gave up some goals. And he was at fault for some of their big letdowns. And that's tough when you get a goalkeeper that gets that reputation a little bit. And I just don't know how a budding franchise like LAFC coming out so strong, you don't trade away a stalwart goalkeeper that you want to ride on through what could potentially be multiple championships. You don't just move on from that piece. I mean, Luis Robles and the Red Bulls, he got in there and they didn't let him go. He's more on the back end of his career when they finally decided to move him, and it was because he was going to cost too much. I didn't see that with Miller, and I don't know how a team sells a goalkeeper like that in the middle. I think he was a little overrated for what he did, and he was a product of his team. And I don't know that we're going to get a clearer picture of him going forward playing with Minnesota because he's got that incredible defense in front of him again. I think he's going to be one of those guys that's going to be inflated for the next 3-4 seasons because he's got some huge names in front of him. I mean, a 2-time defender of the year playing center back right in front of him goes a long way. He's always going to have good numbers, but I don't think it's always going to be his numbers. It's going to be his team's numbers that are reflecting on him.
How much does quality of the defensive unit for you all subtract from your likelihood of picking up a goalkeeper?
In fantasy, for this, in fantasy, you always want to have a good defensive unit.
Oh no,
because you want to have someone who's going to get the clean sheets. It'd be different if we're just talking about like the skill of the goalkeeper himself, but for this conversation, having a better defensive unit is a plus because you get the clean sheets. I think kind of one of the ideal situations is something like what you see in Sean Johnson, where you have someone who's going to get shots, but they're generally weak shots, generally high percentage save shots, so that they can build up the numbers that way. Generally going to get clean sheets. And maybe every once in a while you get a weird penalty, but they can reliably save penalties. and that's where Sean Johnson doesn't come to this conversation because he's not a good penalty stopper. But that's kind of what you're really looking at for fantasy, because I mean the biggest thing is clean sheets. If you don't get a clean sheet, or if you don't make up for it in penalty save, and those are so hard to predict, you're not going to get the good points. You're going to get 3 or 4, and whoever nails the clean sheet, they're going to beat you.
Yeah, I mean, going on that, Sean Johnson and I put Andre Blake up there are probably two of the better athletic shot stoppers in the league right now. And they make a lot of highlight reel plays, but they also don't get the clean sheets because they're having to make too many highlight reel plays, and you can't save all of them. It's not the way the game works. But that said, I will take a guy with a bad defense if he's good enough, and that's evidenced by Evan Bush being on my list. We haven't thought of Montreal as that shutdown defense. I think they had 1 year where they were really considered an elite defense-ish. Other than that, they've always been that middle of the pack, but Evan Bush out of nowhere just is always putting up decent numbers. He's always facing shots. You'll have your clean sheet keeper get you a 5 or a 6 because he picks up a yellow card, and you'll have Evan Bush put up a 4 or a 5 without the clean sheet in some weeks. And that's a testament to how good of a goalkeeper he is, even with the bad defense. And sometimes the bad defense has worked out in his favor because he's consistently getting those extra bonus points. So it really depends on the keeper on that one if you're going to go without the really good defense, because I think my entire list has had pretty much quality defense around them for most of their career. Some of it's the command of the back, some of it's just having really good players in front of them. But defense is always a unit in this game, and you can't pick one without looking at the unit as a whole. So that's going to play a factor, but the guys on my list kind of stand out in their own right for their own reasons, be it penalty saves or longevity or just how consistent they have had their team playing with some rotation in front of them. And those guys really make my list because regardless of the unit, they're always still rising to the top.
Okay, that's fair. I just wanted to throw some names out there to make sure people know that we're not just phoning this in and picking the top people or most points or whatever's going on. Okay, so you give me a list of several players. We've got a nice little group right here. Now I'm going to ask you all to cut it down to your top 3. So, and you guys did. I'll not cop out myself. You guys did hit all the names that I would have considered as well for my short list for this conversation. So now go down to your top 3. Blayne, you started, so Mike, I'll let you take this one.
My top 3. Well, I think I already said my top 3.
It's also easy.
Stefan Fry, Tim Elia, Nick Raimondo.
In that order?
No, do you want me to give them in the order?
No, not necessarily. I'm just gonna check. So, okay, that is Mike's top 3. Why?
Mostly because I think they were consistent. I could rely upon them when they're at home to get a clean sheet, to get a few saves, and so that every time I was looking at bottom line minimum, I was going to get 4 with a really good chance of a clean sheet on top of it. That's pretty much all I can ask for in keepers, and most of the time they would deliver. Then I think with a few of them, they would add on some, penalty saves so that even if they don't get the clean sheet, they get that, you get that rare situation where you get a clean sheet and a penalty save, but for some reason that just never happens to me. I'm not that lucky. But, most of the time they're going to get me a good solid score with an opportunity to get like 8 points. And that's really all you can ask for keepers in this game.
Blayne, your top 3.
Yeah, I've got Fry, Melia, and Robles. Just consistency on those 3. Robles really beats out Raimondo for this last spot because I had more good experiences with him in fantasy. He's been one of those guys in my draft team that I've tended to gravitate towards. Raimondo usually comes off the board a little earlier, or Raimondo's had a little bit weaker defense around him. And it's one of those things. Robles never got injured. I know Ramondo picked up a few knocks later on in his career and had to miss some time. I never saw that with Robles. He was always giving me a good run out no matter when I grabbed him. And I have this strong anti-Red Bull bias, and Robles was one of those safe options that even when I hated Red Bull, he was there. And I think recency bias really plays into some people that might overlook Robles, because lately New York has not been as strong, but they won back-to-back supporter shields based on that defense, I think. And he's been around this whole 3.0 generation, or almost this whole thing, and putting up consistent numbers from 13, 14, 15 on. It's not just been a few good seasons. He's had a long run of it, and I have to put him in there. And then Mealy and Fry both, I mean, two of the strongest defensive units we've seen in MLS come out right here, and these guys have proven that they can handle rotation in players, and they really do command their defenses from the back, and so that gives them that edge to be up here in the top three for sure.
Okay, so for me, my top three are Fry and Robles, as we've already talked about, but I have Johnson in there for the very same reasons that Mike is talking about. Producing a lot of those bread and butter stats I think are really important, and that's something that Stephen Fry and Luis Robles have done as well. The problem for Nick Raimondo with me, and I think that's probably going to be the biggest uproar that we hear from people, is Nick Raimondo. Nick Raimondo was one of the top one or two in 2012. I don't have exact stats for that, but he was probably number 2 right behind Nielsen. And then in 2013, he was still a top 5 keeper right there. But after that, he really drops down to the bottom of that top 10 list as far as point production. There are other players who are just outperforming him. And if you're going to Nick Raimondo as a fantasy manager, you're maybe going to be disappointed a lot of those times, because he is getting some of those PK saves, but that's not going to help you in the long run. On the other hand, people like Sean Johnson, even though he's still relatively new with all this fantasy stuff, he's getting those bread and butter stats that we always need to help have performances without clean sheets. But then people like Robles and Fry have just been so consistently near the top of the point generations and the top of saves and recoveries and clean sheets for the past 6 years that for me, that's harder to overlook than Raimondo always being near the bottom of these lists. So that bumps Raimondo off for me, and man, is it close between two of these players for me. And I'm going to now ask you all the hard question. You've got to drop one of these 3 players, and you've got to give me your starter and your backup for your best Fantasy 11 keeper position. I'll let you decide who goes first, because this is so tough.
Well, I guess I'll start because I feel like I have to defend Nick Raimondo as a good goalkeeper.
Do you? I'm not saying he's bad. I'm just saying he's like 4. He's like 4 on my list. That is not bad, but I mean, he's like 4.
Uh-huh.
Okay, first of all, Blayne put in Robles over Raimondo after 5 minutes ago saying that he couldn't pick a keeper whose team moved on from. Well, Luis Robles is not in the New York tri-state area anymore. Luis Robles is in Florida already. So if we're going to do that category, goodbye. Second of all, you should never let go of hatred for Red Bulls. That's never a thing you should ever. You should embrace the dark side, embrace your anger and your hatred for Red Bulls. It should never be something you should ever pass from. But I mean, on Robles, he's one of the leaders in clean sheets all over of all time. I haven't run the stats since 2012. But I mean, since 2012, he has been one of the top keepers on one of the better defenses in fantasy and in MLS. So I think he's always been a consistent producer that way. And then you throw in the fact that he's the leader in history in made penalty saves. I don't know how you don't have him in the top 3. For my top 2, the one I dropped off was Fry. So I have Nick Raimondo and Tim Melia in my top 2.
Okay, so Mike,
because Fry is really only the clean sheets, and I mean Seattle's defense would do that, consistently and reliably, but you don't get the bonuses that Nick Raimondo gave you.
So who's your number 1? Is Raimondo your starter? He's your number 1?
No, I had Melia as my starter, because Melia did do clean sheets more consistently once Melia became the starter than Raimondo.
Blayne, any response to that?
Edge to Melia. Yes, Blayne. Attack Tim Melia. Go.
Attack Tim Melia. Yeah. The only thing that made that harder to pick Tim Melia is he's had fewer seasons than all these other guys. I mean, he came on later, coming out of the pool goalkeeper spot. Robles is my third guy out. I can't give it to him, and I want to clarify on what Mike said. If New York would have moved on from Robles in 2013, 14, 15, like early on in his career, Tyler Miller played 2 seasons with LA and they shipped him out? Like, that's like drafting a starting pitcher in baseball and giving him 2 years and him putting up decent numbers and then trading a starting pitcher. You just don't invest into somebody and move on from him that quick. If he was a goalkeeper that LA could build around, they wouldn't have traded him. Robles was a guy they could build around, and they did. And so that's why I say you can't move on from a guy early. But Robles served his time. They just didn't want to pay his contract anymore. That's what that was, which sucks because I love Robles for fantasy. He's always been there. Fry gets my number 2 because he was a little clean sheet dependent. He didn't always handle the rotation in front of him as well, and Tim Melia gets my top spot. Call me a homer all you want to. It's good
Homer.
But sample size is smaller but not insignificant. Melia has the best penalty save percentage of any goalkeeper to ever play in MLS, with I think a minimum of 10 stops or a minimum of 10 penalties faced. Like, his average is higher than Raimondo's at this point. I think that says a lot because he trained behind Raimondo for so many years too. But he's done it. He hasn't had as many opportunities, but his opportunities he's had, he's made the most of them. He's commanded a defense that through some good years, through some bad years, through some rotations and injuries. We look at Iko Parra as a 2-time Defender of the Year, but he's also been one of those players that's been plagued by injuries almost his entire career, and I think he's only gone maybe 2 full seasons, 3 at the most, in his career so far. And Melia had to account for all of that too. So he gets my top spot because he's done it with the rotation, and while not as many penalty saves, which it's hard to beat somebody who's been goalkeeping in the league for 20 years for total penalty saves, but that percentage beating out Raimondo in such a short time is astounding to me, and Melia is going to take my top spot for sure.
So I think Melia is someone who gets a recency bonus. I mean, he's been in the top 10 twice in the last 3 years. A lot of that was a good defense at times too. But he's just been so expensive that from the fantasy point of view, I think like that's made him not as go-to from fantasy. I am still arguing against Raimondo. And Mike, I'm using your own words that you were talking about, producing some of those bread and butter stats. You're going to argue against clean sheets being so clean sheet dependent. A PK save is even less likely to happen than a clean sheet. So to rely on PK saves to help be a consistent, substantial fantasy stat is ridiculous to me. And from 2013, at least when I had the detailed stats, to 2019, Nick Raimondo has rarely had more saves or recoveries than Robles or Fry. And if he did, it was only fewer than 10, or very few. But usually those two, Fry and Robles, were going to have more saves and recoveries, which are much more bread and butter stats as far as consistent fantasy bonus point generation than PKs saved. And I will concede clean sheets is definitely one that is hard to predict. But those are bread and butter stats. It's the same reason I like Johnson. It's the same reason why those three guys make the list. Ramondo is 4 for me because he is such a solid keeper. But for me, it is Fry as the number 1 keeper. I don't know. Malia would be a tough call for. Sorry. Fry is the number 1 keeper for me as far as his fantasy is going to go. Next, I would have Robles because they have jockeyed back and forth so much for the best of a top 10 keeper and have such a consistent performance in those just bread and butter keeper stats that we need so badly in fantasy. And number 3 for me is Johnson.
All right, so let me defend using PK.
Okay, PKs.
So, bread and butter stats
Yes.
for keepers isn't as important because you're not going to get that many of them. The real question is whether you get the big ones, is whether you get the goal and whether you get the clean sheet, especially in an unlimited transfer setting. I mean, if you can get the 1 or 2, yeah, that's a consistency and that helps. But if you can consistently get PK saves, that's going to overcome the losses that you have for no clean sheets. Like that makes your week. Like if your keeper, even if he doesn't have any of the other things and he gets the PK saves, that's a good week. It's even though it's not reliable, it replaces goals. So if you can do that, like you're consistent, that puts you over the edge because those are the 2 main stats that matter for goalkeeper. The other thing is just like a little bit of lanyard between 2 and nothing. Now that makes a difference if you can't do that, but it's not like Nick Raimondo was only going to get 2 points. He was generally going to get you 3 or 4. So to me, that puts him over the edge over a lot of the other guys who are like, if they don't get the clean sheets, I'm not getting anything.
I mean, 3 points is pretty pitiful for a goalkeeper. If he gives up a goal, he gets 2 points for playing and then 1 bonus point. That's a pretty sucky goalkeeper score for me. But these guys who are able to generate 2 to 3 points during a game from recoveries and saves, those are much more consistent. Like I just don't think that argument holds up. The bread and butter stats are bread and butter for a reason, and it's the stats that you go to that have the underlying statistical significance for why some players are better than other players, and to hope that there's a PK during a game to help offset a bad game is hoping for your field players to screw up in advantage for your goalkeeper, which is almost as bad as me as relying on the defense to justify having your goalkeeper as your fantasy one. I just don't think PK saves is better than the bread and butter.
Predictability and like it matters. Like you can say like, oh, like this person, you could say Aurelian Collin, oh, you had really good bread and butter stats. I don't know if you did, but just hypothetically if you did. Mm-hmm. Oh, but the red cards you can't predict it, so that doesn't matter. Well, no, it does matter because that absolutely tanks your score. The number of points that are given to PK saves makes that stat matter, and that's more, especially in a limited, unlimited transfer situation. That's going to make all of the difference. In a single game, if you can get that, and Nick Raimondo and with Tim Melia are the 2 keepers, you're like, that could legitimately happen. There's a good chance of them making that save and pulling that off and having a huge week.
And so that's how you pick your keeper. If you are on the fence for 2 keepers in a fantasy team, in a fantasy week, a snapshot, which I don't like doing, but a snapshot fantasy week right here, you're going to go with the guy who might save a PK.
I'm going to look at if that's the tiebreaker between bread and butter, then yeah. I mean, if clean sheets are obviously a clean sheet is the most is the biggest one, but right under that, I think it's PKs like saves and recovery. I mean, that's the difference why Sean Johnson isn't in my top 3. Yeah, Sean Johnson can do all the other stuff and give decent, but he hasn't as good not as great as PK saves, and not as good at getting clean sheets. And if he doesn't get those big point getters, he's not going to get you as far as the other keepers.
All right.
And see, this is where I get with Ramondo. Like, there's been years where I've thought, okay, RSL's defense is good. That's a great clean sheet chance. But I've seen more years where RSL's a lot lower down on my clean sheet list. Whereas, Sporting, other than one outlier year, has always been a clean sheet defense for me. New York, up until about last season, was always on the clean sheet watch. Seattle's the same way. They're always up there for a clean sheet shout. RSL has never been up there like that. They're certain games, sure, but they're never been one of those, and they've always had the nice young defenders that I want to go to more than I wanted to go with Ramondo.
That's
and
true.
With RSL not being such a clean sheet thing, then you have to look at bonus points. And if you really pushed me to go head to head, all things even, I would probably take Bush over Ramondo because he seemed to get better bonus points week in and week out. I may get burned on a PK save a couple of times a year making that decision, but I'll take the bonus points pretty consistently every week over that. And that's why I've had Bush, and I've actually had all of these other goalkeepers besides Ramondo in my draft team. I don't think I've ever picked up Ramondo in my draft team, but I can't overlook the length of his career when we put him in top 5.
I think that's fair. This one, I believe, is going to come down to fan feedback for where it actually ends up being, maybe in some sort of vote. I don't know. Haven't completely decided how we're going to do this final one, but we'll each have our own, and then we'll come to some conclusion for the overall.
I had one more thing.
Go ahead.
And for my top 3 being Melia, Fry, and Robles, those are guys that I saw, maybe not in the elite fantasy players, but in the more casual players. Those are the guys I saw splurged for more than anybody else. There were weeks that playing in the Tacos League, you would see 3/4 of the teams have Melia starting in their lineup. They would rate my lineup stuff from a lot of the not the top 200 players, not the top 250 players. Always asking, where do we cut the fat? And you put goalkeeper, and they're like, I won't budge from Melia, or I won't budge from Fry. Robles not so much, but I mean, definitely Melia and Fry. You had players that would just gravitate towards them, and they would refuse to sub them out for anything if they were playing. And I've never seen that with Ramondo. I don't really think I've seen that with too many other keepers, but I know Melia and Fry both, the defenses were that good. You had players out there saying, I'm not taking them out for anything. They're too consistent, and there's too much potential for a clean sheet. I'm going to ride them out the entire season if I have to.
So we're all good. So we've been joined once again in chat by Quincy Amarikwa, and I have posed this question to him. A bit truncated, but talking about Fry, Robles, Ramondo, and Melia for who he would pick. So maybe we'll let Quincy be our tiebreaker in this situation. Now, he did ask if we're talking fantasy or in-game, because that makes a difference. And I think that's true, and he is uniquely able to talk about that with us right now. But I've said both, and we'll see. We'll see if he's able to respond to us as we're starting to wind down for tonight. But this has been a great discussion, and I hope this is some good content that people have been looking forward to. Maybe missing, I don't know. It has been a little slow without the fantasy picks and recommendations to come through here. But this is the plan of what we're going to be doing for the rest of our positions, is sort of talking the big picture, narrowing it down, and then just keep having to make those tough choices. I mean, it's hard. I talked about earlier how, for me, I was thinking about Zach McMath early on. If I'm going to pick an honorable mention, for me, it's going to be Zach McMath, some for of his journeyman. But even that was hard, because I remember watching Clint Irwin come in and doing so well when he was called up to as an injury replacement, and then he moves on and doesn't do as well at Toronto, and so he's not been in that conversation. But there's just so many good memories there for me that I really considered making him my honorable mention. But I think it has to go to Zach McMath for as much as we've talked.
McMath is one of those guys. I wish he would have gotten a better shot in MLS. I wish some team would have just grabbed him and put him in there as the long-term starter so we could see what he looked like 5 years in a row with one team and see him fully flourish, because he's one of those guys that just bounced around one too many times and never got to really settle in someplace and make it his own team. I think if he had started at one spot, and I don't even remember all the places he has been, but I mean, I think, like, imagine if they had put him in Dallas 5 years ago and we got to see him for 5 seasons playing with Dallas.
Sure.
I think McMath could be in this conversation for top 5 if he had played somewhere consistently. I feel for him because he's been everywhere, and he had Colorado playing really, really well, and then Howard comes in and displaces him because they're paying Howard all the money, and the team gets worse.
So we've had, yeah, you're right. That is so rough. Tim Howard coming in like that. So Quincy has weighed in, and he has said Fry or Robles if it's fantasy at this point, which he gets a starter and a bench, so he could take both. And then out of the 4 that we gave him for in a real game, is it Stephen Fry? So I don't know, Mike. I don't know. Quincy has spoken, but we'll take it to the people.
Well, Quincy just said at this point, Ramondo is retired.
That's fair. That's fair. Always looking for that little legal out. That's Mike right here. Getting it right there. Well, thank you so much, Quincy, for that. And again, those of you who are listening, those of you who are watching, I'll put up a poll later on Twitter for people to vote to see if they can weigh in on this. But I want to hear what you think. I want to get your feedback for this Beck's best team. So it's fun. This is all for fun. We'll post them all at the end, and we'll see. Maybe it got a little heated with Mount Rushmore, as I said. So we'll see how. Secretly, I'm really wanting this to get heated as well, everyone. Mm-hmm. So it's a. I mean, don't be mean just to be mean. Be mean to be fun. I don't know. We'll do that. That's the goal. So I hope you guys have liked that. We're going to wrap up tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Everyone in chat, especially Quincy. Mike, he says, Mike is keen to what's the most valuable piece of information. Ooh. So maybe there is some credit there to you for your PK saves. There it comes. That just stokes the fire. Look at that. So we're going to wrap up tonight. Mike, any final comments before everything is said and done?
I'm just going to I'm just typing out a message to Jay Wiskovich to let him know that you don't hate Ramondo, and I'm just going to sit back and watch.
Let it be said, I do not hate Nick Raimondo. This was a very tough choice.
You hate him?
This was so tough.
I mean, like, what is it about Nick Raimondo that he's like, oh yeah, we all really like him, but we're not going to give him like the top award? Like, what is the universe? What did he do to the universe?
Like, Raimondo's got the whole thing going. He's always been up there, but he's never been the best stats wise. Like, you can be second place every year, and you'll never win goalkeeper of the year that way. And he seems to have always just fallen that little bit short behind somebody else every single season.
All right, Blayne, final thoughts.
I'm glad this one's out of the way. Goalkeeper is one of the hardest ones to pick because we've only got one starting spot. It's always the biggest point of contention when you can only really pick one guy, and in our case, 2 if we put the bench out there. But it gets really tough to narrow these down. At least with the other positions, we're going to be able to open it wide up and say, I can get 4 guys in here. That's a whole lot easier to pick 4 guys than it is to have to pick 1.
Very true. Very true. And final thoughts from myself. Thank you, everyone, for joining us again tonight for what I hope, again, is just some fun fantasy content as we're winding down, as we hope that we're winding down this quarantine time, getting back into fantasy where we will, again, be able to talk about who you should be picking or whatever. We don't know what form this game's going to take at the end whenever it comes back. So we'll see. Whatever we can do to provide that content when we know more about it, we will for sure let you know. And as I said, everything's starting to open back up, depending on what your states is doing or your country. I know we have some international listeners, which you all are doing. I hope everyone is still staying safe and just doing everything they can to help keep the mental health healthy, as long with your body and everything. So that's why we're here. And we appreciate your support during this time and hope that we've been able to help you as well. So thank you so much and good luck.